The world changed this week, not metaphorically, not diplomatically, in the most literal, visceral sense. A missile was aimed at the heart of Israel's nuclear program, and the Middle East has not been the same since. Somewhere in the Negev desert, buried beneath layers of reinforced concrete, guarded by some of the most sophisticated air defense systems on the planet, sits a facility that has defined Israel's strategic existence for over 6 decades. The Negev Nuclear Research Center, known to the world simply as Dimona, is not just a building. It is the physical embodiment of Israel's most guarded secret, its most powerful deterrent, and its ultimate insurance policy against annihilation. Iran just made it a target. According to multiple intelligence assessments and regional security officials, Iranian-linked forces launched a deliberate strike, or a near strike, in the direction of the Dimona complex. The details, as always in this region, are contested. The implications are not. This is not another exchange of fire across the Lebanon border. This is not another drone intercepted over the Red Sea. This is Iran, or forces acting with Iranian coordination, reaching toward the one line that Israel has never allowed anyone to approach: the nuclear line, the existential line. In Jerusalem, emergency security consultations were convened within hours. In Washington, senior officials at the National Security Council were pulled into Situation Room briefings before most Americans had finished their morning coffee. In Tehran, silence, the kind of silence that speaks volumes. The question now gripping every intelligence agency, every defense ministry, and every geopolitical analyst from London to Beijing is not simply what happened. The question is what happens next, and whether what comes next can be controlled. Because when nuclear facilities enter the equation, the rules of engagement that have quietly governed Middle Eastern conflict for decades begin to dissolve. The calculations change, the red lines move, and the margin for miscalculation shrinks to almost nothing. Israel has never officially confirmed it possesses nuclear weapons, but the world has understood for decades that it does. That ambiguity, what strategists call the bomb in the basement doctrine, has been Israel's most powerful deterrent. It has never needed to be tested. Until now, no adversary has dared test it directly. What Iran has done, or attempted, represents a seismic shift in the logic of this conflict. Whether the strike was a warning, a miscalculation, or the opening move in a far more dangerous escalation, the reverberations are already being felt from the Persian Gulf to the halls of NATO headquarters. This is the story of how we got here, what exactly happened, what the intelligence community believes it means, and, most critically, where this is headed. If there was ever a moment that demanded serious, informed analysis, it is this one. Stay with us. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel. Because in the days and weeks ahead, this story will move fast, and you will want to be here when it does. To understand why a missile aimed at Dimona represents such a profound rupture in Middle Eastern security, you have to go back. Not weeks, not months, decades. The story of Dimona is, in many ways, the story of Israel's survival doctrine itself. The birth of the bomb in the basement. In the late 1950s, Israel's founding leadership made a decision that would quietly shape the entire architecture of Middle Eastern geopolitics for the next 70 years. Facing existential hostility from every neighboring Arab state, and with no formal security guarantee from any major power, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion authorized the construction of a nuclear research facility in the remote Negev desert. With covert French assistance, a largely forgotten chapter of Cold War history, the Negev Nuclear Research Center was built outside the town of Dimona. By the mid-1960s, American intelligence had identified the facility's true purpose. By the late 1960s, most serious analysts believed Israel had crossed the nuclear threshold. And yet, by tacit agreement, the world looked away. Israel neither confirmed nor denied. The United States, unwilling to trigger a regional arms race or destabilize a key ally, accepted the ambiguity. The bomb in the basement was born, and with it the unspoken deterrent that has defined Israeli security strategy ever since. Iran's nuclear ambitions and the decades-long collision course. On the other side of this equation, Iran's nuclear ambitions did not emerge overnight either. Following the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran's relationship with nuclear technology shifted from the Shah's civilian program, openly supported by the United States, to something far more opaque and far more threatening. Through the 1980s, devastated by the Iran-Iraq War and convinced of American hostility, Iran's revolutionary leadership began investing quietly in nuclear research. By the early 2000s, the International Atomic Energy Agency was raising alarms. Secret enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordow were exposed. Sanctions were imposed. Negotiations collapsed and restarted and collapsed again. The Obama administration's 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, briefly froze Iran's program in exchange for sanctions relief. Then, in 2018, the Trump administration withdrew from the agreement, and Iran began advancing its enrichment program with renewed and accelerating urgency. By 2024, international inspectors assessed that Iran had enriched uranium to levels approaching weapons-grade purity, closer to a nuclear weapon than at any point in its history. The collision course had been set for decades. What changed recently was the speed. The shadow war turns direct. For years, Israel and Iran fought what intelligence analysts call a shadow war, a sustained covert conflict conducted through assassinations, cyber attacks, proxy warfare, and maritime sabotage, all carefully calibrated to remain below the threshold of open confrontation. Israel assassinated Iranian nuclear scientists. Iran armed Hezbollah and Hamas. Israel struck Iranian weapons convoys in Syria. Iran-backed militias attacked Israeli-linked shipping. The Mossad and the IRGC played a deadly chess match across the region, each move designed to inflict pain without triggering full escalation. That shadow war began breaking into the open in April 2024, when Iran launched an unprecedented direct missile and drone attack against Israeli territory, the first direct Iranian strike on Israel in history. Israel's response, though measured, demonstrated its ability to penetrate Iranian air defenses with precision. The psychological barrier between shadow conflict and open warfare had been breached. The road to Dimona. What followed was a period of escalating exchanges, proxy intensification, and deteriorating deterrence. Each cycle of attack and retaliation pushed the threshold slightly lower. Each miscalculation made the next one more likely. And then, a missile was aimed at Dimona. Whether that missile was a deliberate escalation, a strategic signal, or a catastrophic miscalculation, it landed in territory that no previous Iranian action had ever entered. It touched the nuclear question directly, and that changes everything. Here is what we know, here is what is disputed, and here is what remains dangerously unclear. The sequence of events. In the early morning hours, air raid sirens activated across southern Israel, including in the Negev region surrounding the Dimona complex. Israel's multi-layered air defense network, comprising Iron Dome batteries, the Arrow 3 missile defense system, and David's Sling interceptors, was placed on immediate maximum alert status. Israeli defense forces confirmed an incoming ballistic threat trajectory that defense analysts, reviewing the flight path data, assessed as consistent with a targeting vector aimed directly at the Negev Nuclear Research Center. What happened next depends entirely on who you ask. Israeli defense officials stated that the incoming projectile was intercepted before reaching its intended target. The interception was described as successful. Damage to the Dimona facility was officially denied. The Israeli government, characteristically, offered minimal public detail, consistent with its long-standing policy of nuclear ambiguity and operational security. But the confirmation of an intercept was itself explosive, because an intercept means there was something to intercept, and that something was headed toward Dimona. What Israel claims. From Jerusalem's perspective, the narrative is unambiguous. Iranian coordinated forces, whether directly launched from Iranian territory or fired by an Iranian proxy operating in Syria, Iraq, or Yemen, deliberately targeted Israel's most sensitive strategic installation. This was not an accident of trajectory. This was not a weapon that drifted off course. Israeli military intelligence assessed with high confidence that the targeting was intentional, precise in its intended direction, and represented a qualitative escalation beyond any previous Iranian military action against Israeli territory. Israeli officials were careful in their initial public statements, but in closed briefings to the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, sources indicated that the assessment was unequivocal. This was a deliberate targeting of the Dimona facility. The intent was to strike Israel's nuclear infrastructure. What Iran claims. Tehran's official response was layered with strategic ambiguity of its own. Iranian state media neither confirmed nor denied responsibility for the specific projectile. In a pattern consistent with Iran's doctrine of plausible deniability, officials pointed to the broader conflict environment, noting ongoing military operations, proxy activity across multiple theaters, and what they described as Israeli provocations that had created volatile regional conditions. Unofficially, Iranian-aligned media outlets framed the event differently. Several outlets linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps celebrated what they described as a historic strike on Israeli nuclear infrastructure, carefully stopping short of official governmental confirmation while allowing the narrative to circulate within the information environment. This is a tactic Iran has employed repeatedly: official denial, unofficial celebration, deniability preserved, message delivered. The weapon in question. Intelligence assessments from multiple Western agencies focused significant attention on the nature of the projectile itself. Early analysis suggested a medium-range ballistic missile, possibly a variant of Iran's Fatah or Khaybar-Shakan series, both of which have demonstrated the range and accuracy profile consistent with a strike from either Iranian territory, Syrian-based launch platforms, or Houthi-controlled territory in Yemen. The use of a ballistic missile, rather than a drone or cruise missile, is significant. Ballistic missiles follow a high arc trajectory, reach hypersonic speeds during terminal descent, and are considerably more difficult to intercept than slower-moving platforms. The decision to use such a weapon against Dimona, if confirmed, suggests a level of deliberate planning and capability that goes well beyond opportunistic escalation. What remains unknown. Several critical questions remain unresolved, and those uncertainties are, in many ways, as dangerous as the confirmed facts. Was this strike ordered at the highest levels of the Iranian government, or was it an autonomous action by IRGC commanders operating with independent authority? Was it a coordinated signal, designed to demonstrate capability and intent without expecting to succeed? Or was it a genuine attempt to penetrate Israeli air defenses and strike the facility itself? And perhaps most critically, does Iran understand what crossing the Dimona threshold means for Israeli decision-making? Because Israel's response calculus at the nuclear level operates by a completely different set of rules. There are targets. And then there are targets that rewrite the rules entirely. Dimona is the second kind. What Dimona actually is. The Negev Nuclear Research Center sits approximately 13 kilometers southeast of the city of Dimona in southern Israel. From the air, it appears as a collection of nondescript industrial structures surrounded by an exclusion zone enforced with lethal authority. There are no public tours. There are no official photographs. There is no confirmed public accounting of what happens inside its walls. What the international intelligence community has assessed, over decades of satellite analysis, defector testimony, and careful inference, is this. Dimona is not merely a research facility. It is the production heart of Israel's nuclear arsenal. The plutonium reprocessing plant beneath its surface, first revealed to the world by Israeli technician Mordechai Vanunu in 1986, is believed to have produced enough fissile material for between 80 and 400 nuclear warheads, depending on which assessment you consult. This is not a symbolic target. This is the physical foundation of Israel's existential deterrence. Striking Dimona successfully would not merely damage Israeli military capability, It would fundamentally alter the strategic balance of the entire Middle East, potentially permanently. The doctrine it protects. Israel's nuclear posture rests on what strategists call the Samson option, a doctrine of last resort that holds, in its most fundamental form, that Israel will not be destroyed without taking its enemies with it. The name is deliberate, biblical, absolute. This doctrine has never needed to be invoked because it has never needed to be tested. The credibility of the deterrent, the certainty in every adversary's mind that Israel possesses nuclear weapons and the will to use them under existential threat, has been sufficient. No state actor has ever directly targeted Israeli nuclear infrastructure, until now. By targeting Dimona, regardless of whether the strike succeeded or failed, Iran has entered territory that previous adversaries, including far more powerful ones, deliberately avoided. It has forced a question that Israel's strategic community has never had to answer publicly. What is the response when the deterrent itself is targeted? Geographic and infrastructure significance. Beyond its nuclear function, the Dimona complex sits within a geographic and infrastructural context that amplifies its strategic weight considerably. The Negev Desert, long developed as Israel's strategic rear, housing military bases, technology corridors, and critical infrastructure, would be fundamentally compromised by a successful strike on Dimona. The radiological consequences of a strike that breached the reactor or weapons storage facilities would render large portions of southern Israel uninhabitable for generations. Prevailing wind patterns would carry contamination toward populated centers. The humanitarian catastrophe would be measured not in casualties from the initial strike, but in the long-term displacement of hundreds of thousands of Israeli civilians. Iran's strategic planners understand this arithmetic. The selection of Dimona as a target, even as a demonstrated capability rather than an achieved strike, is a message written in the language of existential threat. Operational implications for both sides. For Israel, the operational implications are immediate and severe. The Israeli Defense Forces must now reassess the integrity of the air defense envelope around Dimona. If a ballistic missile reached an intercept necessary proximity to the facility, it means Iran, or Iran's proxies, have developed a strike package capable of threatening the installation. That gap must be closed. It will be closed, but the closure requires resources, repositioning, and a fundamental reassessment of the threat matrix. More significantly, Israel must now make a decision that its strategic doctrine has never previously required. How do you respond to an attack on your nuclear infrastructure without triggering the very escalation your nuclear doctrine is designed to prevent? The deterrent exists to avoid war. But if the deterrent itself is attacked, what preserves the deterrence? For Iran, the operational calculus is equally complex but oriented differently. Tehran has demonstrated, to its own population, to its proxy network, and to the watching world, that it can reach Dimona. Whether the strike succeeded or not is almost secondary to the message. The capability has been advertised. The psychological barrier has been shattered. The regional strategic picture. The ripple effects extend far beyond the Israel-Iran bilateral equation. Saudi Arabia, which has long maintained that it will pursue its own nuclear capability if Iran achieves one, is watching this situation with acute attention. The Abraham Accords partners, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, are recalculating their exposure. Jordan and Egypt, sharing borders with Israel, face the prospect of radiological risk from a conflict they have no direct role in shaping. And in the background, watching every development with patient strategic interest, sit Russia and China, both of whom have significant relationships with Tehran and significant equities in how this crisis resolves. The targeting of Dimona has not just escalated a bilateral conflict. It has activated every fault line in the broader regional and global order simultaneously. When the world's most sensitive military installation becomes a target, the analytical community does not speculate. It mobilizes. Within hours of the confirmed intercept over the Negev, intelligence agencies across 3 continents were reassessing their threat models. Think tanks that had spent years tracking Iranian missile development were pulling archived assessments and running new calculations. Military analysts who had long warned of this precise scenario were being pulled into closed briefings with policymakers who had previously dismissed their warnings as theoretical. The theoretical had become operational. The intelligence community assessment. According to intelligence assessments circulating among senior Western officials in the immediate aftermath of the event, the strike was not assessed as an isolated, impulsive action. The trajectory analysis, the weapon selection, and the timing all pointed toward a deliberate, premeditated operation, one that had been planned, rehearsed, and executed with a level of precision that suggested significant advance preparation. Analysts at multiple Western intelligence agencies noted that the targeting of Dimona required detailed knowledge of Israeli air defense radar coverage, interception timing windows, and the geographic coordinates of the facility itself, information that does not come from open sources. The operational intelligence required to plan such a strike implies either sophisticated Iranian reconnaissance capability, intelligence sharing from a third-party state actor, or both. This assessment, if accurate, carries profound implications. It means this was not a warning shot fired in anger. It was a carefully prepared military operation. Missile proliferation experts weigh in. Analysts specializing in Iranian ballistic missile development have spent years documenting Tehran's systematic investment in extending both the range and the precision of its missile arsenal. The trajectory of that investment has been unmistakable and deliberate. Experts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies have noted that Iran's latest generation of ballistic missiles, including the Fatah hypersonic missile unveiled in 2023, represents a qualitative leap in Iranian strike capability. Unlike earlier generations of Iranian missiles, which were powerful but relatively inaccurate, the newer systems incorporate precision guidance technology that narrows the circular error probable to a range capable of targeting specific buildings within a large complex. Dimona is a large complex. With precision guidance, its most sensitive structures become individually targetable. The implications of that technological evolution for Israeli air defense planning cannot be overstated. Iron Dome was designed primarily for short-range rockets. Arrow 3 was designed for high-altitude ballistic missile intercepts. But hypersonic glide vehicles, which alter their trajectory during terminal descent, represent a category of threat that current Israeli defense architecture was not fully optimized to defeat. The fact that an intercept was achieved is reassuring. The fact that one was necessary is not. Strategic think tank analysis. Analysts at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace have both flagged the same critical concern in their assessments of this event: the danger of misread signals in a crisis environment where both sides are operating under conditions of maximum psychological pressure. Their argument is structural. In a conventional conflict, both parties generally have a shared understanding of the escalation ladder. Each rung is visible, the consequences of climbing it are understood, and there are established diplomatic backchannels that can slow or halt the ascent. But when nuclear infrastructure enters the targeting calculus, the escalation ladder changes shape entirely. The rungs compress, the speed of potential escalation accelerates, and the backchannels that might otherwise function as circuit breakers become harder to activate in real time. Analysts warn that the greatest danger in the current crisis is not a deliberate decision by either side to go to war. It is a sequence of actions and reactions, each individually rational from the perspective of the actor taking it, that collectively produce an outcome neither side intended or desired. That dynamic has a name in strategic studies. It is called inadvertent escalation, and history suggests it is far more common than deliberate war. Military analyst perspectives. Retired senior military officers with experience in Middle Eastern theater operations have offered a more operationally focused analysis. Their assessment centers on what they describe as the response obligation problem that now faces the Israeli Defense Forces. In military doctrine, a failure to respond to an attack on core strategic infrastructure, particularly infrastructure of this sensitivity, is interpreted by adversaries as an indication of either incapacity or unwillingness to defend it. Either interpretation invites further probing. Israel cannot allow that interpretation to take hold, but the nature and scale of the response creates its own set of dilemmas. A response proportionate to a conventional missile strike may be insufficient to re-establish deterrence at the nuclear level. A response calibrated to the nuclear significance of the target risks triggering the very escalation cycle that Israeli strategic doctrine has spent 60 years trying to prevent. Military analysts describe this as the deterrence restoration dilemma, and they note with considerable gravity that there is no clean solution to it. Academic and policy expert views. In academic circles focused on nuclear security, the Dimona targeting has triggered a fundamental reassessment of a concept that has underpinned Middle Eastern stability for decades: the stability of Israel's nuclear ambiguity posture. Policy experts at institutions including Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs have long argued that Israel's neither confirm nor deny nuclear posture functions as a stabilizing mechanism precisely because it keeps adversaries uncertain about both capability and intent. That uncertainty, paradoxically, is what makes the deterrent credible. But those same experts now raise a pointed question. Does that ambiguity remain stabilizing when an adversary demonstrates willingness to target the physical infrastructure of the program itself? Or does the ambiguity, by preventing Israel from issuing explicit nuclear warnings, actually reduce deterrence precisely when deterrence is most needed? It is a question for which the academic literature has no settled answer, which means the policymakers making decisions in Jerusalem and Washington right now are navigating without a reliable map. But the other side has a point, and in a crisis of this magnitude, where the distance between analysis and catastrophe is measured in decisions made under extreme pressure, the opposing view deserves more than a footnote. It deserves serious, unflinching examination. The case for restraint in interpretation. Not every analyst who has studied this event has reached the same conclusions as the Western intelligence mainstream. A significant and credible body of geopolitical analysis argues that the dominant narrative, deliberate Iranian escalation toward Israel's nuclear threshold, may be doing exactly what crisis narratives in the Middle East have historically done: overstating intent, underestimating miscalculation, and accelerating toward conclusions that serve certain political agendas more than they serve the truth. The argument begins with a simple but important question. If Iran genuinely intended to strike Dimona, to actually destroy or damage Israel's nuclear infrastructure, why would it do so with a single ballistic missile, using a trajectory that Israeli defense systems had the capability, however narrowly, to intercept? A state actor with serious intent to strike the most heavily defended installation in the Middle East would plan a saturation attack, dozens of simultaneous projectiles from multiple vectors designed to overwhelm interception capacity. That is not what happened here. What happened here looks, to some analysts, less like a strike and more like a demonstration. The signal, not the strike. Several analysts with deep experience in Iranian strategic culture argue that what occurred over the Negev should be understood primarily as a signaling operation, a carefully calibrated demonstration of capability designed to communicate a message to Jerusalem, Washington, and the watching world, without the genuine intention of destroying the target. Iran's strategic communication doctrine has a long history of this pattern. The April 2024 direct strike on Israeli territory, unprecedented in scale, was launched with sufficient advance warning to American and Jordanian officials that the vast majority of projectiles were intercepted before reaching Israeli territory. Tehran then declared the operation complete and signaled a return to equilibrium. The strike was massive in its optics, limited in its actual damage, precise in its political messaging. The Dimona trajectory, in this interpretive framework, follows the same logic. Iran is telling Israel, and more importantly, telling the United States, that it has the capability to reach Dimona. It is not necessarily saying it intends to use that capability to destruction. The capability, once demonstrated, becomes the bargaining chip, the proxy attribution problem. A second alternative interpretation centers not on Iranian intent but on Iranian control, or more precisely, the limits of it. Iran's proxy network across the Middle East, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria, operates with varying degrees of independence from Tehran's direct command authority. While the IRGC's Quds Force maintains coordination relationships with all of these groups, the operational decisions made at the field commander level are not always subject to real-time approval from Supreme Leader Khamenei or IRGC General Staff. This matters enormously in the context of the Dimona event. If the projectile was launched not by Iran directly, but by a proxy actor operating with delegated authority, or even acting unilaterally in the fog of an active regional conflict, then the attribution of deliberate Iranian strategic intent becomes considerably more complicated. Some intelligence analysts have specifically flagged the Houthi movement in Yemen as a potential actor in this scenario. The Houthis have demonstrated both the capability and the strategic recklessness to attempt exactly this kind of strike, and their command relationship with Tehran, while real, is not one of total control. A Houthi decision to target Dimona would represent a catastrophic miscalculation by a proxy actor, not a deliberate escalation ordered by the Iranian state. The distinction is critical. Responding to Iran as if it ordered a strike it did not directly order risks triggering a war based on a misattribution. It has happened before in this region. It can happen again. The domestic politics dimension. A third alternative interpretation focuses not on Iranian military strategy, but on Iranian domestic politics, a dimension that Western analysis frequently underweights. Iran is not a monolithic actor. Its decision-making architecture involves competing power centers, the Supreme Leader's Office, the IRGC, the conventional military, the diplomatic establishment, and the elected government, each with its own institutional interests, threat perceptions, and risk tolerances. In periods of domestic political pressure, economic crisis, or leadership uncertainty, the IRGC in particular has historically engaged in military adventurism that serves its institutional interests more than it serves coherent national strategy. Analysts at the European Council on Foreign Relations have noted that Iran's internal political environment in the current period is one of unusual tension. Economic pressure from sanctions, public discontent, and a leadership succession dynamic that creates incentives for hardline elements within the IRGC to demonstrate strength and relevance. In this reading, the Dimona trajectory may be less about Iranian grand strategy and more about internal IRGC politics, a demonstration of capability designed as much for domestic consumption and factional positioning as for external strategic effect. The diplomatic opportunity hidden in the crisis. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, several senior diplomatic analysts have argued that the current crisis, despite its terrifying optics, contains within it a diplomatic opportunity that risks being destroyed if the escalatory narrative becomes self-fulfilling. Both Iran and Israel have strong structural incentives to avoid a full-scale war. Iran's economy, already battered by decades of sanctions, cannot sustain the consequences of open conflict with Israel and the United States simultaneously. Israel, despite its military superiority, faces a multi-front threat environment and a domestic political landscape that is deeply fractured. Neither side wants the war that their actions are making more likely. That gap, between what both sides are doing and what both sides actually want, is where diplomacy lives. But diplomacy requires both parties and their external sponsors to resist the momentum of the escalation narrative long enough to find it. The window, analysts warn, is narrow, and it is closing. We have arrived at the most consequential question of this entire documentary. Not what happened, not why it happened, but what comes next, and whether the world has the wisdom, the restraint, and the diplomatic architecture to prevent the worst of what is now possible. The honest answer is that nobody knows, but the serious analyst does not stop at uncertainty. The serious analyst maps the terrain ahead as clearly as the available evidence permits. So let us do exactly that. What we know with confidence. Let us first establish the confirmed foundation before projecting forward. Iran, or forces operating within Iran's strategic orbit, launched a ballistic projectile on a trajectory consistent with targeting the Negev Nuclear Research Center at Dimona. Israel's air defense network successfully intercepted that projectile before it reached the facility. No damage to the Dimona complex has been officially confirmed. Israeli security leadership convened emergency consultations in the immediate aftermath. Western intelligence agencies assessed the strike as deliberate and premeditated, rather than accidental or opportunistic. These are the confirmed facts. Everything beyond them exists on a spectrum of probability, assessment, and inference. What remains critically uncertain? Several questions of enormous strategic consequence remain unresolved, and may remain so for days or weeks. The precise chain of command behind the launch, whether it originated at the highest levels of the Iranian government, within autonomous IRGC command structures, or through a proxy actor operating with delegated authority, has not been definitively established in the public domain. The full technical specifications of the weapon used and what they imply about the maturity of Iran's precision strike capability against hardened targets remain subject to ongoing intelligence analysis. And perhaps most critically, Israel's intended response, its timing, its scale, and its specific targets is being deliberated right now in closed rooms in Jerusalem, with inputs from Washington and consequences that will reshape this region regardless of what form it takes. The uncertainty is not a failure of journalism or analysis. It is the nature of the crisis moment. And it is precisely why the next developments demand the closest possible attention. Upcoming developments to watch. In the immediate term, several specific developments will serve as critical indicators of which direction this crisis is heading. Watch the United Nations Security Council. An emergency session has either been convened or is being demanded by multiple member states. The language used, and more importantly, the vetoes cast, will signal the degree to which great power competition is hardening the crisis into something unresolvable through multilateral diplomacy. Watch the movement of American naval assets. The repositioning of carrier strike groups in the Eastern Mediterranean or Persian Gulf is not merely a military logistics story, it is a message to Tehran, to Jerusalem, and to every regional actor calculating its next move. American carrier movements in a Middle Eastern crisis have historically served as the most reliable real-time indicator of how seriously Washington assesses the escalation risk. Watch the back-channel signals. Qatar, which has historically served as an intermediary between Washington and Tehran, and Oman, which quietly facilitated the original Iran nuclear deal negotiations, will be receiving urgent diplomatic traffic right now. Whether those channels are active and productive, or whether they have gone silent, will tell us more about the trajectory of this crisis than any public statement from any government. Watch the oil futures market at opening bell. Markets do not lie about geopolitical risk. The price of crude oil in the next trading session will be a real-time referendum on how the global financial community is assessing the probability of sustained conflict. Scenario 1. The escalation path. The first forward scenario is the one that keeps every serious analyst awake at night. In this scenario, Israel calculates that a failure to respond decisively to the Dimona targeting will fundamentally erode its nuclear deterrence posture, and that the erosion of deterrence is itself an existential risk greater than the risk of escalation. Israel launches a significant retaliatory strike against Iranian territory, targeting not proxy infrastructure in Syria or Iraq, but assets on Iranian soil itself, potentially including Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran, facing domestic political pressure and the institutional imperatives of the IRGC, responds to strikes on its own territory with a massive multi-vector assault: missiles, drones, proxy activation across Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria simultaneously. American forces in the region are drawn into defensive operations. U.S. casualties occur. Congressional authorization for military action is invoked or bypassed. American strikes on Iranian territory begin. At that point, the conflict has escaped every containment framework that currently exists. Russia and China face the choice of how explicitly to support their Iranian partner. The global economy absorbs an energy shock of historic proportions. The nuclear question, not just Israel's but Iran's developing capability, moves from the background to the foreground of every decision being made. This is the scenario the entire diplomatic architecture of the past 40 years was designed to prevent, and it is more reachable from today's starting point than it has ever been before. Scenario 2. The de-escalation path. The second scenario requires more from human institutions than the first, but it is not beyond reach. In this scenario, back-channel communications between Washington and Tehran, facilitated by Qatari or Omani intermediaries, establish a shared understanding that the Dimona strike was either a proxy action beyond Tehran's full control or a signaling operation that has achieved its communicative purpose and need not be repeated. Iran, facing the genuine prospect of Israeli retaliation against its nuclear infrastructure and the economic devastation of full-scale conflict, signals, quietly, deniably, but unmistakably, a willingness to return to a lower operational tempo. Israel, receiving credible assurances through American channels that the Dimona targeting will not be repeated, and facing American pressure to avoid an escalation that would consume U.S. military and political bandwidth simultaneously with the Ukraine commitment, calibrates its response to Iranian proxy infrastructure rather than Iranian territory itself. The response is painful enough to restore deterrence optics, contained enough to avoid triggering the full escalation spiral. A fragile, uncomfortable, deeply unstable equilibrium is restored. Not peace, not resolution, but a pause. A breathing space in which the underlying conflict remains entirely unresolved, but the immediate catastrophe is averted. History is full of crises that seemed, in the moment, to be tipping inevitably toward catastrophe, and did not. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the 1973 Yom Kippur War nuclear alert, the 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm. In each case, the difference between catastrophe and survival was not the absence of danger. It was the presence, at the critical moment, of decision-makers with enough restraint, enough communication, and enough awareness of what they stood to lose to pull back from the edge. The question now is whether those decision-makers exist in sufficient number and with sufficient authority to make the same choice again. The closing question. A missile was aimed at Dimona. It was intercepted. The facility still stands. The arsenal it protects remains intact. The deterrent has not been destroyed, but something else has been destroyed. Something less tangible and perhaps more important. The psychological barrier that kept nuclear infrastructure off the targeting list in the Middle East for 6 decades has been breached. That barrier cannot be fully restored by an interception. It can only be restored by a combination of decisive response, credible deterrence, and, ultimately, a diplomatic framework that addresses the underlying conflict driving both sides toward the edge. That framework does not currently exist. Building it under conditions of active crisis, with mistrust on every side, and domestic political pressures pushing decision-makers toward confrontation rather than compromise, is the hardest thing that human diplomacy can attempt. It has been done before. Against terrible odds, in terrible moments, it has been done before. Whether it can be done again, here, now, with these actors under these pressures, is the question on which the trajectory of the next decade may depend. We will be watching, we will be reporting, and we will be here every step of the way as this story unfolds. If this analysis has given you something that the noise of the 24-hour news cycle cannot, context, depth, and a serious framework for understanding what is at stake, then do one thing before you leave. Subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, because this story is not over. It is, in many ways, just beginning. And when the next development breaks, you will want to understand it not just as a headline, but as a chapter in the larger story we have told together here tonight. Stay informed, stay analytical, and stay with us.